Dear friends, welcome to ePathshala. I am Dr. Vishal Jadhav, Department of Sociology, Tilak Maharashtra Vidyapeeth, Pune. Today, we are going to look at a module titled Glocalization, Global, Local and the Political, which is part of the Political Sociology paper. This module will try and assess the different terms of globalization, glocalization, globalization, in which it talks about how the particular becomes the universal, how the universal becomes the particular, and how there is a synthesis of these two processes. It involves not only the economic realm, nor just the political, but also the cultural and the social. Ritzer, who has talked about McDonaldization, in which he talks about the homogenizing effect of globalization, this module will try and assess how a local kind of a response leads to contestations within the concept of globalization, which is glocalization. Glocalization and its usage. Glocalization means the creation of products or services intended for the global markets but customized to suit the local cultures. The term was modeled on Japanese word doka kuka, which originally meant adapting farming techniques to one's own local condition. Although it would be difficult to trace the first user of the term glocalization in its original Japanese usage, the first time the term was used in English can be attributed to Roland Robertson. Although the term glocalization has come to be frequently used since the late 1980s, there were several related terms which have been in use. One such term is indigenization, which is used to describe an act of making something native. That is what happens when locals take something from the outside and make it their own. For instance, Africanization, Indianization. However, indigenization is slightly different from glocalization and can be seen similar to localization. According to Nederveen Peters, there are three views on the issue of globalization of cultures. The first view is expressed in terms of the clash of cultures, where local cultures might resist globalized phenomena. The second notion is best expressed in the phrase of McDonaldization as used by George Ritzer. This view suggests a world dominated by a single homogenizing culture that erases any differences of local cultures. The third view is that of hybridization or synthesis. According to this line of thought, much of human evolution of culture can be seen as exchanges, diffusion, etc., where crossbreeding, borrowing and adjustment of the local needs can be seen as very common. Khonkar, however, argues that although glocalization has resonance with the above mentioned categories, there are some important differences as well. Glocalization is also different from hybridization in the sense that glocalization involves blending, mixing and adapting of two or more processes, one of which must be local. Glocalization, to be meaningful, must incorporate at least one component that addresses the local culture, system of values, practices and so on. For instance, new architectural designs blending the Western and local motifs emerged in Singapore. A popular understanding of globalization in the 20th century was conceptualized by Robertson is that it is, quote, the interpretation of the universalization of particularization and the particularization of universalism. Khonkar, building on Robertson's framework, argues that globalization or glocalization should be seen as an interdependent and affiliated process. The problem of simultaneous globalization of the local and the localization of the globality can be expressed as the twin processes of macro-localization and micro-globalization. The rise of religious or ethnic revivalist movements can be seen under the rubric of macro-localization, where the local boundaries, local ideas, practices and institutions are seen to have expanded worldwide. Micro-globalization involves incorporating certain global processes into the local setting. Consider new production techniques, print industry, computer industry or marketing strategies with a specific location of its emergence has now become a global phenomenon. Social movements such as the feminist movement or ecological movements which emerge in a certain local context and over a period. These movements spread far beyond that locality into larger spatial and historical arena. Overcoming space is globalization. In this view of globalization, globalization is glocalization. This view is somewhat different from the way Giddens has conceptualized the liaison between global and the local. Globalization for Giddens is the reason for revival of local cultural identities in different parts of the world, while in Giddens' view, local is the provider of the response to the forces that are global. Khonkar argues that local itself is constituted globally. Ritzer flags of yet another term, globalization, to define or to refer to what he calls growth imperatives, pushing organizations and nations to expand globally and to impose themselves on the local. For Ritzer, globalization is the sum of glocalization and globalization. Key propositions of glocalization. The main propositions of glocalization are not too different from the main arguments of globalization. Khonkar argues that the chief arguments of glocalization are: 1. Diversity is the essence of social life. 2. Globalization does not erase all differences. 3. Autonomy of history and culture gives a sense of uniqueness to the experiences of groups of people where we define them as cultures, societies or nations. 4. Glocalization is the notion that removes the fear from many that globalization is like a tidal wave erasing all the differences. 5. Glocalization does not promise a world free from conflicts and tensions, but a more historically grounded understanding of the complicated yet pragmatic view of the world. One of the reasons for the popularity of theories of glocalization is that they stand in stark contrast to the modernization theory. Debates on globalization according to Roland Robertson. Robertson argued that discussions and debates on globalization depend upon the various perspectives generated and then how they impact various intellectual fields. Likewise, in the field of sociology and in social and cultural theory, the debate begins with general topic and then how different meanings are attributed to the very idea of globalization. Globalization as a phenomena usually has been observed in a sense of large-scale phenomena where there is a preoccupation among sociologists to deal with macro-sociological approaches towards perspective on globalization, and there exist those as well who view these phenomena with micro-sociological perspectives. Robertson borrows the idea from Ferguson, mythology about globalization referring to the development that involve triumph of culturally homogenizing forces over all others. This includes other attributions like bigger is better, that locality and even its history gets eliminated. This debate around globalization also involves the aspect that how this category has been reflected in broadening of the discipline of sociology itself, how the subject of sociology as a field of intellectual inquiry has shaped the understanding of globalization, and how the global discourses in the field of sociology itself got constructed and ways in which it is practiced at global level. Robertson argues that there is a proposal of global sociology and attempt has been made in various ways by internationalizing, extending it culturally, or by developing anti-ethnocentric curriculum of sociology. It is in this context that Robertson writes, quote, "Indeed, the problem of global sociology as a sociology which confirms and includes native sociologies parallel the more directly analytical issue to which I have already referred. This is the problem of the relationship between homogenizing and heterogenizing thrusts in globalization theory. Many sociologists are happy, or at least not unwilling, to agree that sociology ought to be internationalized and de-ethnocentralized, but they are apparently much less inclined to engage in direct and serious study of the empirical, historically formed global field per se. Unquote. The etymology of glocalization. According to the Oxford Dictionary of New Words, the term glocal and process noun glocalization are formed by telescoping global and local to make a blend. The idea of glocalization has been modeled on Japanese dokakuka, which derives from dokaku, meaning living on one's own land. It means originally and relates to the agricultural practices of adapting one's techniques of local conditions. It is also adopted in Japanese business for global localization, a global outlook adapted to local conditions. Robertson writes that it is during 1980s when the term glocal and glocalization became aspects of business jargon. It is important to note here that the locus of these three terms was Japan. Japan as a country has cultivated and shaped for itself the spatio-cultural significance over a long period of time. It has become again now, in the words of the Oxford Dictionary of New Words, meaning one of the main marketing buzzwords of the beginning of the 90s. The idea of glocalization in economic terms refers to micro-marketing, which deals with the tailoring and advertising of goods and services on a global or near global basis to increasingly differentiated local and particular markets. Robert writes, in the world of capitalist production for increasingly global markets, the adaptation to the local and other particular conditions is not simply a case of business responses to existing global variety, to civilizational, regional, societal, ethnic, gender, and still other types of differentiated consumers, as if such variety of heterogeneity existed simply in itself. The idea of glocalization in economic terms refers to micro-marketing, which deals with the tailoring and advertising of goods and services on a global or near global basis to increasingly differentiated local and particular markets. Robert writes, in the world of capitalist production for increasingly global markets, the adaptation to the local and other particular conditions is not simply a case of business responses to existing global variety, to civilizational, regional, societal, ethnic, gender, and still other types of differentiated consumers, as if such variety of heterogeneity existed simply in itself. Robertson writes, quote, from the consumer's point of view, it can be significant basis of cultural capital formation. This, it should be emphasized, is not its only function. The proliferation of, for example, ethnic supermarkets in California and elsewhere does to a large extent cater not so much to difference for the sake of difference, but to the desire for familiar and or nostalgic wishes. On the other hand, these two can also be basis of cultural capital formation. Robertson argues that there is a widespread tendency to think of global local problematic as involving a polarity, referring to the claim that we live in a world of local assertions against globalizing trends, a world in which the very idea of locality is sometimes cast as a form of opposition or resistance to the hegemonically global, or one in which the assertion of locality or Gemeinschaft is seen as the pitting of subaltern universals against the hegemonic universal of dominant cultures and or classes. In this context, Robertson gives the example of German culture civilization distinction at the global level. The old notion of quote-unquote good culture is pitted against the quote-unquote bad notion of civilization. In this traditional German perspective, local culture becomes in effect national culture, while civilization is given a distinctively global worldwide coloring. In references to the local cosmopolitan distinctions, Hannah has remarked that for local diversity happens to be the principle which allows all locals to stick to their respective cultures. At the same time, cosmopolitans largely depend on other people carving out special niche for their cultures. Thus, there can be no cosmopolitans without locals. This point has some bearing on the particular nature of the intellectual interest in the approach to the local global issue. For Robertson, historical conscious regarding deceptive modern or postmodern problem of relationship between the global and the local, the universal and the particular, and so on, is not by any means as unique to the second half of the 20th century as many would have us believe. Referring to the works of Greenfield, Robertson points that recent study of the origins of nationalism in England, France, Germany, Russia, and America, with the notable exception of English nationalism, she shows that the emergence of all national identities, such constituting the most common and salient form of particularism in modern world, developed as a part of an essentially international process. Robertson argues that from an interpretative standpoint, the concept of globalization has involved the simultaneity and the interpenetration of what are conventionally called global and the local, or in more abstract vein, the universal and the particular. The local global problematic hinge on the view that contemporary conception of locality are largely produced in something like global terms. But this certainty does not mean that all forms of locality are thus substantively homogenized, notwithstanding the standardization, for example, of relatively new suburban fortress communities. An important thing to recognize in this connection is that there is an increasingly global-wide discourse of locality, community, home, and the like. One of the ways of considering the idea of global culture is in terms of its being constituted by increasing interconnectedness of many local cultures, both large and small. Robertson argues that global culture is entirely constituted by such interconnectedness. He argues that we should be careful not to equate the communicative and interactional connecting of such cultures, including very asymmetrical forms of such communication and interaction, as well as third cultures of mediation, with the notion of homogenization of all culture. Robertson also elaborates his point by discussing about the conditions of both cultural pluralism as well as geographical pluralism, when he argues that the idea of locality, indeed of globality, is very relative. He writes, in spatial terms, a village community is of course local relative to a region of a society, while a society is local relative to a civilizational area, and so on. Relativity also arises in temporal terms. Contrasting the well-known pair consisting of locals and cosmopolitans, Hanare has written that what was cosmopolitan in the early 1940s may be counted as moderate form of localism by now. I do not in the present context get explicitly involved in the problem of relativity or relativism, but sensitivity to the problem does inform much of what I say, unquote. Robertson argues that there are certain conditions that are currently promoting the production of concern with the global-local problematic within the academy. In talking specifically of the spatial compression dimensions of globalization, King remarks increasing numbers of proto-professionals from the so-called third world societies who are traveling to the core for professional education. The educational sector of core countries depends increasingly on this output of students from the global periphery. It is this experience of flying around the world and needing schemata to make sense of what they see on the one hand, and encountering students from all over the world in the classroom on the other, which forms an important experiential basis for academics of what King calls totalizing and global theories. I would maintain, however, that it is interest in the local as much as the totally global which is promoted in this way. Robertson writes that in numerous contemporary accounts, then globalizing trends as regarded as in tension with local assertions of identity and culture. Thus, ideas such as the global versus the local, global versus tribal, the international versus the national, and the universal versus the particular are widely promoted. For some of these oppositions are puzzles. For some, the second part of these oppositions is reaction against the first, and for some, it is contradictions. In the perspective of the contradiction, the tension between, for example, the universal and the particular may be seen either in the dynamic sense of being a relatively progressive source of overall change, or as a modality which preserves an existing global system in a state. We find both views in Wallerstein's argument that the relationship between the universal and the particular is basically a product of expanding world systemic capitalism. Robertson writes, quote, "Only what Wallerstein calls anti-systemic movements, and then only those which effectively challenge its metaphysical presuppositions, can move the world beyond the prepositions of its present, that is, capitalist condition. In the light, we may regard the contemporary proliferation of minority discourses, Jan Mohammed and Lloyd 1990, as being encouraged by the presentation of a world system," unquote. It should be also noted here that many of the enthusiastic participants in the discourse of minorities describe their intellectual practice in terms of singular minority discourse, Jan Mohammed and Lloyd 1990. This suggests that there is indeed a potentially global mode of writing and talking on behalf of, or at least about, minorities. Globalization as a companion to glocalization. Globalization, the term first propounded by George Ritzer, argues that, quote, "While it does not deny the importance of glocalization and in fact complements it, globalization focuses on the imperialist ambitions of nations, corporations, organizations, and other entities, and their desire, indeed, their need to impose themselves on the various geographic areas. Their main interest is in seeing their power, influence, and in some cases profits grow, hence the term globalization throughout the world." While citing examples of globalizations like gourmet foods, handmade crafts, custom-made cloths, and rolling stone concerns, which are now more and more available throughout the world and more likely to move transnationally than ever in history, he also indicates few limitations. There is, he argues, comparatively little affinity between globalization and something. First, there could simply be far less demand of a local product throughout the world. One reason for this is that the distinctiveness of something tends to appeal to far more limited tastes, be it gourmet food, handmade crafts, or rolling stones, or Silk Road concerns. Second, the complexity of a local product, especially the fact that it is likely to have many different elements, means that it is more likely that it will have at least some characteristic that will be off-putting for, or will even offend large number of people in many different cultures. Third, the local product or its various forms are usually more expensive, frequently more than expensive than competing forms. For instance, gourmet food is much more costly than fast food. Its higher cost means, of course, that far fewer people can afford it. As a result, the global demand for expensive forms of distinct local commodities is minuscule. In comparison to that, for the inexpensive varieties of global products, for instance, a hamburger at McDonald's is far cheaper than Lebanese shawarma found in any metro city, or other handcrafted pashmina shawls by Kashmiris of India is higher in price than any woolen garment found in a retail shop. Besides, not all would have a taste for pashmina shawl or Lebanese cuisine, that widely available other option. Fourth, there is a cost cutting on advertising and marketing of local products because the prices are high and demand is comparatively low. This serves to keep the demand further low. The cost of shipping, that is insurance, careful packing and packaging, special transport of gourmet food, the Van Gogh paintings, etc., are usually very high, adding to the price and thereby reducing the demand. Fifth, few things are more difficult to mass manufacture, and in some cases Silk Road concerns, Van Gogh exhibitions, impossible to produce in this way. Because it is relatively scarce, the local products sometimes retain the status and distinction from mass manufactured products. Ritzer argues that, quote, local forms of something are loaded with distinctive content. Among other things, this means that they are harder and more expensive to produce, and the consumers, especially in other cultures, find them harder to understand and appreciate. Why we need to discuss the relevance of glocalization? Discussion on glocalization has a very different view than any of the conventional perspectives on global conflict. For instance, cultural conflict is seen as the one between homogenizing global processes and the local culture under globalization debate. However, perspective offered from the viewpoint of glocalization is somewhat different. First, globalization is far too broad a concept, encompassing as it does all transnational processes. It needs further refinement to be useful in the context, such as distinction between globalization and glocalization. When the differentiation is made, it is clear that the broad process of globalization already encompasses important conflicting processes. Second, the local is increasingly pictured as insignificant and a marginal player in the dynamics of globalization. What Ritzer probably meant was that the local is relegated to the secondary importance in conceptualization of cultural conflict debate. But the fact that there is a little of the local remains that has been untouched by the global. Thus, much of what we think of as the local is in reality the glocal. The interaction of the global and the local produces unique phenomena that are not reducible to either the global or the local. If the local alone is no longer the source that it was once of uniqueness, at least some of the slack has been picked up by the global. It is even conceivable that the local, glocal, and the interaction amongst various localities are, or at least can be, significant source of uniqueness and innovation. The glocalization debate offers us alternative view of traditional globalization debate, where local is not relegated to the periphery but capitulated to a higher position. A trend to romanticize local and even glorify glocal is seen in many writings. For instance, Jonathan Friedman associates cultural pluralism with a de-hegemonizing, de-homogenizing world, incapable of a formally enforced politics of assimilation or cultural hierarchy. Later, he links the decline of hegemony to liberation of the world arena, to the free play of already extant but suppressed projects and potential new projects. Then James Watson's book called McDonald's in East Asia, which flags off ideas on global adaptations and generally downplay of global impositions, and also tends to describe the global phenomena in positive terms. In this particular module, we have seen how local identities, local belongingness, local imaginaries also become very important in a globalized world, where individual cultures, communities, nations wish to preserve their unique identityness, and in doing so ensure that there is glocalization of global phenomena. This can be seen in art, in culture, in social relations, in languages, and even in economic and political realms. Thank you.